Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. In the fading light of a spring afternoon in 399 BC, an old man sits in a small prison cell in Athens, surrounded by his grieving friends. He is 70 years old, his body still vigorous despite the decades, his mind as sharp as it has ever been. Outside the cell, the city goes about its business, unaware that it is about to commit an act so monstrous that it will echo through 2,500 years of human history. The jailer enters carrying a clay cup. Inside is hemlock, ground from the poisonous plant and mixed with water. The man who must drink it shows no fear. He has spent the entire day in philosophical conversation, discussing the immortality of the soul with the calm detachment of someone analysing a geometric proof. His friends are weeping openly, some cannot bear to watch, but the old man takes the cup without hesitation. He asks if he can pour a libation to the gods. The jailer says there is only enough poison for the fatal dose, no more. The old man smiles at this detail, finding humour even now. He lifts the cup to his lips and drinks it down in one steady motion, as if it were nothing more than wine at a symposium. Then he begins to walk around the cell as instructed until his legs grow heavy. His name is Socrates, and Athens, the city he loves, the city he has spent his entire life trying to improve through relentless questioning and philosophical inquiry, has just sentenced him to death for the crime of making people think. He lies down on the simple bed. The poison works its way upward from his feet, numbing his body gradually, inexorably. He remains conscious until the end, still talking, still teaching, still maintaining the examined life he has always preached. When the numbness reaches his abdomen, he speaks his final words to his friend Crito. "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." Asclepius is the god of healing. The sacrifice of a rooster is a traditional offering after recovery from illness. In his last breath, Socrates suggests that death is a cure, a healing, a release from the sickness of life itself. Then the numbness reaches his heart, and the wisest man in Athens is still. Consider the strangeness of what has just happened. A democratic city, proud of its freedom and its culture, has just executed its most brilliant citizen for asking questions. A man who never took money for his teaching, who claimed to know nothing, who spent his days in the marketplace engaging anyone who would talk with him about virtue and justice and the good life, has been condemned as a corrupter of youth and an enemy of the gods. This was not a tyrant's decree. This was democracy in action. 500 Athenian citizens, ordinary men chosen by lot, voted for his death. They heard the evidence, such as it was. They listened to his defence, which was more of a lecture than a plea for mercy. And they decided that Athens would be better off without him. They were catastrophically wrong. The execution of Socrates would become the defining failure of Athenian democracy, an act so shameful that it would haunt Western civilization forever. The questions Socrates asked, the method he invented, the life he lived, these would prove far more durable than the verdict that condemned him. But to understand how this happened, to grasp how a stonemason's son became the father of Western philosophy, and why his own city killed him for it, we must go back to the beginning, to a world very different from our own, where Athens was rising toward its golden age, and a boy was born who would change human thought forever. Before we begin this journey into the ancient world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that means a great deal to me and helps bring more stories like this to life. I'm always curious to know where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me. And now let the noise of the modern world fade away as we travel back 2,500 years to the Athens of Socrates. The Athens into which Socrates was born in 469 BC was a city discovering itself, a place on the brink of becoming the intellectual centre of the Greek world, though no one knew it yet. The great buildings that would define classical Athens, the Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, these did not yet exist. The Acropolis was still scarred from the Persian Wars, its temples burned by the invading army just 11 years before Socrates' birth, but something was stirring in this small city-state at the edge of the Aegean. Athens had helped defeat the Persian Empire, the greatest military power the world had ever seen. The Greeks, outnumbered and outmatched, had driven back King Xerxes and his massive army. At Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea, the impossible had happened. Free citizens fighting for their own cities had defeated an empire built on conquest and slavery. The victory changed Athens fundamentally. The city had not been a major power before the Persian Wars. Sparta was the acknowledged military leader of Greece. Corinth was wealthier. But Athens had contributed the most ships to the Greek fleet, and it was Athenian strategy and Athenian courage that had won the naval battle at Salamis, the turning point of the war. In the aftermath, Athens created the Delian League, ostensibly an alliance of Greek city-states to defend against future Persian aggression. In reality, it was an Athenian empire. The League's treasury, initially kept on the sacred island of Delos, would be moved to Athens. The tribute paid by member cities would fund the great building projects and support the democracy that was emerging as Athens' distinctive contribution to political life. Democracy. The word itself was almost new, coined perhaps just a generation or two before Socrates' birth. It meant rule by the demos, the people, not rule by the best men, aristocracy, not rule by the wealthy, plutocracy, not rule by a single king, rule by the citizens themselves, gathered in assembly to debate and vote on the affairs of state. It was a radical experiment. Most Greek cities were ruled by oligarchies, small groups of wealthy families who controlled political power. Sparta had its strange dual kingship and its rigid military society. But Athens was trying something different, something that seemed to many Greeks dangerous and unstable. The democracy of 469 BC was not yet the mature system it would become by Socrates' adulthood. Pericles, the great democratic leader who would dominate Athenian politics for a generation, was just beginning his career. The reforms that would extend political participation to the poorest citizens were still being implemented. But the essential principle was established. Every male citizen of Athens, regardless of wealth or family background, had the right to speak in the assembly and to vote on matters of war and peace, law and policy. This was the city into which Socrates was born, sometime in the early summer of 469 BC. The exact date is not recorded. The Athenians did not keep careful birth records for common citizens, and Socrates' family was decidedly common. His father was named Sophroniscus. He was a stoneworker, a man who carved marble and limestone for building projects and monuments. It was skilled labour, respectable work, but not prestigious. Sophroniscus owned no great estate. He did not belong to the aristocratic families whose genealogies stretch back to the heroes of myth. He was a craftsman, a man who worked with his hands. Socrates' mother was Phaenareton. According to later tradition, she was a midwife, a woman who assisted at births. The symbolism would not be lost on Socrates' followers. He would describe his own philosophical method as meutic, the art of midwifery. Just as his mother helped women give birth to children, Socrates helped men give birth to ideas. The family lived in the Dame of Alapes, one of the small local districts that made up Greater Athens. It was not a fashionable neighbourhood. There were no grand houses here, no gardens where wealthy citizens held symposia. This was a working district, home to craftsmen and small farmers, people who made their living through labour rather than land or trade. The child was named Socrates. The name was not uncommon in Athens, derived from essos, meaning safe or sound, and kratos, meaning power or strength. Sound strength, or safe power. It was a good solid name for a stoneworker's son, though it would come to mean something very different to later generations. We know almost nothing about Socrates' early childhood. He left no writings. The sources we have, primarily his students Plato and Xenophon, and the comic playwright Aristophanes who mocked him, focus on his adult life and teachings. The boy himself remains invisible to history, but we can reconstruct the world he inhabited. As the son of a craftsman, young Socrates would have grown up in his father's workshop, learning the trade that was expected to be his livelihood. Stone carving was demanding work. It required strength to handle the heavy tools and marble blocks. It required precision to carve clean lines and smooth surfaces. It required patience to work slowly and carefully, knowing that a single mistake could ruin hours of labour. The workshop was probably attached to the family home, a modest structure with a few rooms opening onto a small courtyard. The family would have lived simply. They could afford slaves, at least one or two, as even families of moderate means typically did in Athens. But there was no surplus wealth for luxury. Young Socrates would have spent his days watching his father work, learning to hold the chisel at the proper angle, understanding how different stones required different approaches. Marble, limestone, granite, each had its own character, its own way of responding to the tools. A good stoneworker learned to read the stone, to find its natural lines of strength and weakness, to work with the material rather than against it. But Socrates was growing up in Athens, and Athens was changing. The city was filling with ideas, with arguments, with new ways of thinking about the world. The great dramatists were beginning their work. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon, was writing tragedies that explored the relationship between humans and gods, between fate and choice, between justice and power. And there were teachers, new kinds of teachers, who called themselves sophists. These were men who travelled from city to city, claiming to teach virtue, rhetoric, and the skills needed for success in public life. They charged fees, sometimes substantial ones, for their instruction. The wealthy young men of Athens flocked to them, eager to learn the arts of persuasion that would help them succeed in the democratic assembly and the law courts. Young Socrates would have heard about these sophists, perhaps even seen them in the agora, the great marketplace that was the heart of Athenian public life. But such teaching was far beyond his family's means. If Socrates was to receive any education beyond his father's craft, it would have to come through the basic schooling available to Athenian boys of modest families. That education, such as it was, focused on 3 areas, each designed to shape the complete citizen that Athens required. First came literacy and numeracy, taught by a teacher called a grammatistes. Young Socrates would have learned his letters by writing them on a wax tablet with a stylus, the same tool his father used to mark measurements on stone. The alphabet itself was a relatively recent innovation. The Greeks had borrowed it from the Phoenicians just a few centuries earlier and adapted it by adding vowels, creating the most efficient writing system the ancient world had yet produced. Reading meant primarily reading Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not just literature to the Greeks, but sacred texts, repositories of wisdom, models of heroic virtue, and catalogues of the gods and their deeds. Every educated Athenian could recite passages from memory. The stories of Achilles and Odysseus, of Troy and the journey home, these formed the foundation of Greek cultural identity. Arithmetic was essential for a commercial society. Young Socrates learned to add and subtract, to calculate areas and volumes, to handle the basic mathematics of trade and taxation. The Greeks used letters for numbers, which made calculation more difficult than our modern system. But they developed remarkable sophistication in geometry, which they saw as revealing eternal truths beneath the chaos of the physical world. Second came music, taught by Achitharists. Music for the Greeks was not mere entertainment. It was a force that shaped the soul, that could cultivate virtue or encourage vice depending on its character. Young Socrates learned to play the lyre, the most common stringed instrument, and to sing. He memorized traditional songs, many of them ancient paeans to the gods or commemorations of historical events. The Greeks believed that different musical modes produced different effects on character. The Dorian mode was thought to encourage courage and steadiness. The Phrygian mode inspired martial spirit. Other modes were considered dangerous, likely to make young men soft or encourage dissolute behaviour. Music was thus a moral education as much as an artistic one. Third came gymnastics, the physical training that took place in the palestra, the wrestling school. This was perhaps the most important part of Athenian education, reflecting a culture that valued physical excellence alongside intellectual development. The ideal was kalokagathia, beauty and goodness, the unity of physical and moral virtue. In the palestra, young Socrates learned wrestling, the most prestigious of Greek sports. He learned to run, both short sprints and longer distances. He threw the discus and the javelin. He practiced jumping, using weights to increase distance. All of this was done naked, as was the Greek custom. The word gymnasium literally means place of nakedness. The training was intense and sometimes brutal. Boys wrestled in sand mixed with oil, grappling until someone submitted or could not continue. Injuries were common. But the palestra was also a social centre where boys formed friendships, competed for honour, and learned the values of their class. Socrates received this basic education, though he would later question many of its assumptions. We know he could read and write, though he chose never to write anything himself, believing that written words could not respond to questions or adapt to different audiences. We know he had some musical training, though he was not particularly accomplished, and he would later compose his first poems only while waiting for execution. And we know he underwent the physical training expected of an Athenian citizen, though his appearance in adulthood, stocky and ungainly, would suggest he was no athlete. But what set Socrates apart from other boys receiving this standard education was not any exceptional talent in these areas. It was something else, something that began emerging during these formative years, a capacity for intense concentration, an ability to become so absorbed in thought that he lost awareness of his surroundings, and most distinctively an irresistible urge to question everything. But something else was happening in young Socrates' mind, something that would set him apart from every other stoneworker's son in Athens. He was beginning to think differently, to ask questions that went beyond the practical matters of daily life. He was discovering that the world as it appeared was not necessarily the world as it was, and that the answers people gave to fundamental questions, questions about justice, courage, wisdom, beauty, were often confused, contradictory, and unexamined. When this intellectual awakening occurred, we cannot say. Perhaps it was gradual, a slow accumulation of curiosity and puzzlement. Perhaps there was a moment of revelation, a conversation or an observation that opened new pathways in his mind. What we know is that by the time Socrates reached young adulthood, he had decided that his life would not be spent carving stone. It would be spent examining ideas, questioning assumptions, and searching for truth through conversation and dialectic. But before he could fully embrace this calling, Socrates would have to fulfill his duties as an Athenian citizen, and those duties, in the middle years of the 5th century BC, would increasingly involve war. The Athens of Socrates' youth was not just a city of ideas and democracy. It was an imperial power engaged in increasingly complex and dangerous conflicts with its rivals. The transformation from ally to hegemon had happened quickly. The Delian League, formed to defend against Persia, had become an Athenian empire in all but name. The tribute that member cities paid to Athens funded the great building program that Pericles championed. The Parthenon, begun when Socrates was about 18 years old, rose on the Acropolis as a monument to Athenian glory and the goddess Athena. But it was built with money that other Greek cities believed should have been used for common defence, not Athenian grandeur. Resentment grew. Sparta, Athens' former ally against Persia, watched with alarm as Athenian power expanded. The two cities represented fundamentally different visions of Greek society. Sparta was conservative, oligarchic, militaristic, suspicious of change and innovation. Athens was democratic, mercantile, cultural, innovative, and increasingly aggressive in asserting its power. The tension exploded into open conflict in 431 BC when Socrates was 38 years old. The Peloponnesian War, the great struggle between Athens and Sparta that would consume the Greek world for a generation, had begun. As an Athenian citizen, Socrates was obligated to serve in the military when called. Athens had no professional army. Instead, it relied on citizen soldiers, men who in peacetime were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and in wartime became hoplites, the heavy infantry that formed the backbone of Greek military forces. Socrates served as a hoplite in at least 3 campaigns during the war. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, hoplite service was typically the obligation of men who could afford the expensive armour and weapons required. A full panoply, bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves for the legs, a large round shield, a long spear and a sword represented a significant investment. That Socrates, the son of a stoneworker, served as a hoplite rather than as a light-armed soldier or rower suggests his family had achieved at least moderate prosperity. Second, and more importantly, Socrates' military service reveals a side of his character that is easy to miss in the philosophical dialogues. This was not a man who spent his entire life in abstract contemplation. He could fight. He could endure hardship. He could face death with the same calm courage he would later show in his prison cell. The first campaign we know about was at Potidaea in 432-429 BC. Potidaea was a city in northern Greece that had revolted from Athenian control. The Athenians laid siege to the city, and Socrates was among the troops sent to enforce the blockade. The siege lasted more than 2 years, stretching through winters so harsh that soldiers died of exposure. According to accounts preserved by Plato and others, Socrates distinguished himself at Potidaea not just for courage but for endurance. While other soldiers huddled in their tents, Socrates would stand guard in the freezing cold, wearing nothing but his ordinary light cloak, the same thin garment he wore year-round in Athens. His fellow soldiers were amazed. He seemed impervious to discomfort, capable of ignoring physical hardship through sheer mental discipline. There was also an incident during the campaign where Socrates saved the life of a young aristocrat named Alcibiades. In a skirmish with enemy forces, Alcibiades was wounded and surrounded. Socrates, despite being older and less prestigious, fought his way to the young man, defended him, and helped carry him to safety. Alcibiades later insisted that Socrates deserved the prize for valour, the military honour awarded for exceptional courage. Socrates refused it, directing the honour to Alcibiades instead. The second campaign was at Delium in 424 BC. This was not a siege but a pitched battle, and it was a disaster for Athens. The Athenian army was defeated and routed by the Boeotians. In the chaos of retreat, when panic turned soldiers into a fleeing mob, Socrates remained calm. He withdrew slowly and deliberately, maintaining his defensive posture, protecting those around him. His steadiness saved lives. Men who would have been cut down by pursuing cavalry survived because Socrates' composure provided a rallying point. Alcibiades, who fought at Delium on horseback, later described watching Socrates during the retreat. He said Socrates walked as calmly as he did through the streets of Athens, stalking like a pelican, swivelling his head from side to side to watch for threats. The description, preserved in Plato's Symposium, captures something essential about Socrates. Even in the midst of military defeat and mortal danger, he maintained the observer's detachment, the questioning awareness that characterized his entire life. The third campaign was at Amphipolis in 422 BC, though we know less about Socrates' role in this expedition. What is clear is that by his mid-40s, Socrates had established himself as a man of exceptional courage and endurance, someone who could face physical danger with the same philosophical calm he brought to every other aspect of life. But military service was only part of Socrates' life during these years. When not on campaign, he was in Athens, developing the practice that would make him famous and ultimately lead to his execution. He was learning to ask questions. Socrates' method, the practice that would become known as the Socratic method or Socratic dialectic, emerged gradually through the 440s and 430s BC. It was not something he learned from another teacher. The sophists who dominated Athenian intellectual life had their own approaches, focused on rhetoric and persuasion, on teaching young men how to argue convincingly regardless of truth. What Socrates developed was something different, and, to many Athenians, deeply unsettling. The method was deceptively simple. Socrates would approach someone, typically a person with a reputation for wisdom or expertise, a general, a politician, a poet, a priest, and ask them to define a concept central to their work. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is beauty? The person, flattered to be asked and confident in their knowledge, would offer a definition. Then Socrates would begin to question, gently at first, then with increasing precision. Let's say a general defines courage as standing firm in battle, not fleeing in the face of the enemy. This seems reasonable. Everyone knows that brave soldiers hold their ground while cowards run away. But Socrates would ask, what about the Spartans at Thermopylae who retreated to draw the Persians into a trap? They ran away tactically, then turned and fought. Was that cowardice or courage? The general would have to admit it was courage. So courage is not simply standing firm. Perhaps courage is endurance of the soul then, persistence in the face of danger. But what about foolish endurance, Socrates would probe? A man who rushes into battle without weapons or strategy, who gets himself killed pointlessly, is he courageous? No, the general would admit that's recklessness, not courage. So courage requires wisdom as well as endurance. But what kind of wisdom? And now we're back to defining another term we don't understand. Or consider a wealthy man confident in his understanding of justice. Socrates asks for a definition. Justice, the man says, is giving each person what they're owed, what they deserve. This sounds good. It's the basis of law and commerce. But Socrates pushes. If you owe a sword to a friend who has gone mad, should you give it to him? Clearly not, the man admits. That would be dangerous. So justice is not simply giving people what they're owed. Perhaps justice is helping friends and harming enemies then. This was a common Greek belief. But Socrates questions this too. Does harming people ever make them better? If justice is a virtue that improves those who practice it, how can it involve making others worse? And can a truly just person become unjust through bad luck or circumstance? If not, then what does it mean to say someone deserves something? Don't they deserve good treatment if they're good and bad treatment if they're bad? But how do we judge who is truly good? Within minutes, what seemed like a simple question, what is justice, has exploded into a tangle of difficulties. The confident expert finds himself unable to defend the definition he offered, unable to provide a better one, and uncertain whether anyone truly knows what justice is at all. This was called elenchis, the Greek word for refutation or cross-examination. But it was more than simple refutation. Socrates was demonstrating something profound and disturbing, that people didn't truly understand concepts they used confidently every day. They had opinions, beliefs, conventional wisdom inherited from their fathers and teachers, but they didn't have knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that could withstand rigorous examination and emerge intact. The process was often uncomfortable, even humiliating for Socrates' interlocutors. To be shown publicly that you don't understand justice, despite being a politician who makes judgments about it daily, or that you don't understand courage, despite being a general who commands soldiers, was a blow to reputation and pride. In a culture that valued honour and status as much as classical Athens did, such embarrassment was not easily forgiven, and Socrates was not gentle about it. He could be ironic, even mocking, especially when dealing with those who were most confident in their expertise. He would adopt a pose of ignorance, claiming to know nothing, asking to be enlightened by those wiser than himself. Then he would demolish their positions with surgical precision, leaving them looking foolish before an audience that had gathered to watch the spectacle. Imagine a sophist, one of the professional teachers who charged hefty fees to teach virtue and rhetoric. He's in the agora, surrounded by potential students, displaying his eloquence and wisdom. Socrates approaches, all humble curiosity. "I've heard you teach virtue," he says. "That's wonderful. I've spent my life trying to understand what virtue is. Perhaps you can enlighten me." The sophist, pleased to have such a prominent audience, launches into an elaborate explanation of how virtue can be taught, how his methods improve young men, how his students go on to great success in public life. Socrates listens politely, then asks a simple question. "But before we discuss whether virtue can be taught, shouldn't we first understand what virtue is?" The sophist offers a definition, perhaps something like, "Virtue is excellence in one's role. For a ruler, it's the ability to govern well. For a soldier, it's courage. For a craftsman, it's skill in his craft." Socrates probes. "So virtue is different for different people? The ruler's virtue is different from the soldier's virtue?" "Yes," the sophist agrees. "But is there not something common to all these virtues? Something that makes them all virtues rather than vices or mere skills?" The sophist struggles to articulate what this common element is. "And if virtue is excellence in one's role," Socrates continues, "was not Achilles excellent in his role as warrior? Yet he refused to fight, let his comrades die, sent his friend to death, all out of wounded pride. Was this virtue?" The discussion continues, each answer generating new questions, until the sophist who began by confidently claiming to teach virtue finds himself unable to define what virtue is. The audience, initially sympathetic to the sophist, begins to shift. Some laugh, others look troubled. The young men who are considering becoming his students quietly slip away. The sophist, humiliated and angry, leaves, and Socrates, having demonstrated that the supposed expert knows nothing, continues his day as if he's just had a pleasant conversation about the weather. The process was often uncomfortable, even humiliating for Socrates' interlocutors. To be shown publicly that you don't understand justice, despite being a politician who makes judgments about it daily, or that you don't understand courage, despite being a general who commands soldiers, was a blow to reputation and pride. In a culture that valued honour and status as much as classical Athens did, such embarrassment was not easily forgiven. But Socrates insisted he was doing his victims a favour. He compared himself to a gadfly, the persistent insect that stings a horse to keep it from becoming sluggish. Athens, he argued, was like a large, noble horse that had become lazy. It needed to be stung into wakefulness, forced to examine itself rather than drift through life on unexamined assumptions. The metaphor reveals much about Socrates' self-understanding. He was small, annoying, persistent, impossible to ignore. He had no political power, no wealth, no position, but he had a gift for disturbing people's peace, for making them think about things they'd rather not examine too closely. He also claimed to have something else, something that set him apart from ordinary humans. He spoke of a daimonion, a divine sign or inner voice that warned him away from certain actions. It was not a voice that told him what to do, but rather what not to do. A guardian spirit that prevented him from making certain mistakes. This daimonion would later become part of the charges against him. In a city where religion was a civic duty and atheism was seen as a threat to social order, Socrates' claim to have a personal divine sign seemed suspicious. Was he introducing new gods? Was he rejecting the traditional gods of Athens? The relationship between Socrates and conventional religion would prove fatal. By his 40s, Socrates had become a fixture in the Athenian agora, a daily presence as familiar as the monuments and temples that surrounded the marketplace. Every morning, after the briefest of breakfasts, perhaps a bit of bread dipped in wine, he would leave his modest home and make his way to the centre of Athenian life. There, in the shade of the colonnades, beside the long stowers where merchants displayed their goods, among the crowd of citizens, foreigners and slaves that filled the public spaces, Socrates would begin his day's work of questioning. His approach was systematic yet opportunistic. He would engage anyone willing to talk, politicians making their way to the council house, generals discussing military strategy, poets reciting their latest verses, craftsmen taking a break from their labours, young aristocrats with time and money to spare, foreigners visiting from other Greek cities or beyond. No one was exempt from his questioning, and no subject was too basic or too advanced. He had favourite locations: the stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, where political discussions naturally occurred, the shops of craftsmen, where he might spend hours watching a shoemaker or carpenter work while discussing whether they truly understood their craft, the gymnasiums and wrestling schools, where young men trained their bodies while Socrates tried to train their minds. His appearance was distinctive and, by Athenian standards, unfortunate. Socrates was short and stocky, barrel-chested, with a broad face that seemed to expand outward rather than following normal human proportions. His nose was flat and snub, pushed into his face like a satyr's. His eyes were prominent, bulging slightly, giving him a look of permanent surprise or intensity. His lips were thick, and his mouth when he spoke seemed somehow too large for his face. Contemporaries agreed he resembled the Seleni, those mythological creatures associated with Dionysus, part human and part animal, often depicted as ugly but wise. The comparison was not meant as a compliment, yet Socrates seemed to embody it willingly. If the Seleni were outwardly bestial but inwardly divine, he was content to be the same, ugly on the outside, beautiful within. He made no effort to improve his appearance. While wealthy Athenians visited barbers daily, carefully grooming their beards and hair, anointing themselves with perfumed oils, and selecting clothes designed to display their status, Socrates seemed indifferent to such concerns. He wore the same simple cloak, a threadbare hymation, year-round. In summer, when other men wore light linen, he wore his cloak. In winter, when others bundled in multiple layers, he wore the same single garment. His footwear was equally minimal. He often went barefoot, even in winter, even on rough streets that would have torn the feet of softer men. When he did wear sandals, they were the simplest kind, barely more than soles tied to the feet with leather straps. During his military service, his fellow soldiers marvelled at his ability to walk across frozen ground wearing these flimsy sandals while they huddled in whatever warm gear they could find. His hygiene was apparently minimal by Athenian standards, which were quite high. While the wealthy bathed daily in olive oil and visited public baths, Socrates seemed content with occasional washing. His body odour, in an age before deodorants and when regular bathing with soap was uncommon even for the fastidious, must have been pronounced. Yet people still gathered around him, drawn by his mind despite the physical unpleasantness of his presence. His home life was sparse. He lived in a small house, probably inherited from his father, in the Dem of Alopes. The house was modest even by middle-class standards, with just a few rooms arranged around a small courtyard. There was no garden, no elaborate furniture, no decoration beyond what was absolutely necessary. Socrates owned almost nothing. No fine clothes, no jewellery, no artworks, no collection of anything that might signify wealth or status. He had married, though the circumstances and timing are unclear. His wife was Xanthippe, whose name has become proverbial for a difficult, nagging spouse. Later tradition, particularly stories told by philosophers wanting to emphasize Socrates' patience, painted her as a shrew, constantly complaining about his poverty, his refusal to earn money, his habit of spending days in philosophical conversation while the family went without. But consider her situation honestly. She was married to a man who owned nothing, earned nothing, contributed nothing to the household economy, a man who had inherited a trade but refused to practice it, a man who spent his days talking to other men in the marketplace, neglecting his family, bringing no income home, a man whose activities were increasingly attracting dangerous attention from powerful people. Her frustration, if she indeed was frustrated, seems entirely reasonable. They had children, 3 sons. The oldest, Lamprocles, was perhaps in his late teens by the time of Socrates' death. The second son was named Sophroniscus after Socrates' father. The third, Menexenus, was still very young in 399 BC, perhaps just a toddler. Some sources suggest that Menexenus was the son of a second wife, which would have been unusual but not unheard of in Athens. What kind of father Socrates was remains unclear. He clearly spent more time in philosophical conversation than in domestic life. His poverty meant his sons would inherit nothing material. They would grow up in the shadow of a famous but controversial father, and after his execution, they would bear the stigma of his condemnation for the rest of their lives. Yet despite his ugliness and his poverty, Socrates possessed a quality that drew people powerfully. There was a charisma, a personal magnetism that made young men in particular want to be near him, to watch him work, to learn his techniques. Part of this was his absolute fearlessness in conversation. He would challenge anyone regardless of their status or reputation. A wealthy politician, a famous general, a visiting sophist charging enormous fees, all were subject to the same relentless questioning. But there was more to it than mere intellectual courage. Socrates had a sense of humour, an ability to make the process of philosophical examination entertaining as well as enlightening. He could be playful, ironic, even mischievous. When someone made a particularly foolish claim, he would affect the most innocent expression of confusion, asking them to explain as if he were a simple person who just couldn't quite understand. The more they explained, the deeper they dug themselves into logical contradictions, until the absurdity of their position became clear to everyone watching. He also had a gift for analogy and metaphor. When discussing virtue, he would compare it to a craft, asking whether it could be taught the way carpentry or shipbuilding could be taught. When talking about the soul, he would use the metaphor of health and disease, suggesting that vice was to the soul what illness was to the body. These comparisons made abstract philosophical concepts concrete and accessible. His voice, according to those who heard it, was not particularly pleasant. It was somewhat high-pitched and had a penetrating quality that carried across crowds. But what he said compensated for how he sounded. He could make philosophy not just intellectually demanding but emotionally engaging. People laughed during his conversations. They gasped when he exposed a particularly clever contradiction. They leaned forward, absorbed, when he was building to an important point. His physical endurance remained remarkable throughout his life. He could stand in one place for hours, lost in thought, completely motionless. There are accounts of him standing stock still from dawn to noon, thinking through a problem, oblivious to the crowd that gathered to watch the spectacle. When he finally resolved whatever he'd been considering, he would simply resume walking as if nothing unusual had occurred. He seemed genuinely indifferent to physical comfort or discomfort. During winter campaigns, while other soldiers huddled around fires, Socrates would stand guard in the freezing cold wearing his usual thin cloak, apparently unbothered. During summer heat, when others sought shade and complained of the temperature, he maintained the same steady pace of conversation and activity. Most remarkably, he claimed to experience something no one else did, the daimonion, a divine sign or inner voice that warned him away from certain actions. This was not a voice that told him what to do, but one that prevented him from making mistakes. It would come upon him suddenly, a feeling of prohibition, warning him not to proceed with a planned action. He might be about to leave on a journey, and the daimonian would stop him. Later, he would learn that the road he would have taken was attacked by bandits, or that illness struck those who made the trip. This daimonian was personal to Socrates, a private religious experience that set him apart from other Athenians. It would later become part of the charges against him, evidence that he was introducing new divine beings and neglecting the traditional gods of Athens. But to Socrates, the daimonian was simply one more piece of evidence that humans were not alone in the universe, that there were forces beyond our understanding that took interest in human affairs. His daily routine then was simple but distinctive. Rise early, eat sparingly, go to the agora, engage in philosophical conversation until evening, return home for a simple dinner, sleep. No accumulation of wealth, no pursuit of honours, no social climbing or political manoeuvring. Just the daily practice of examining life, questioning assumptions, trying to understand what virtue is and how humans can achieve it. This was the life Socrates lived for decades, from his 40s through his 60s, always the same pattern, always the same practices, and slowly, inevitably, the resentments built. The powerful men he had exposed as ignorant did not forget. The fathers of young men he had taught to question authority did not forgive. The city he was trying to improve, trying to wake from its dogmatic slumber, was growing increasingly tired of his stinging. Yet despite his ugliness and his poverty, Socrates attracted followers. Young men, particularly aristocratic young men with time and resources, gathered around him. They watched him question their elders, they learned his techniques, they began to imitate him, interrogating their own fathers and teachers, exposing the ignorance of those who claimed to know. This was dangerous. Athens was a democracy, but it was not a tolerant democracy. The freedom to speak in the assembly did not extend to questioning the fundamental values and beliefs that held the city together, and Socrates, by training a generation of young men to question everything, was soaring at the roots of social order. Among his followers were some of the most notorious figures in Athenian history. Alcibiades, the brilliant but unstable aristocrat who would betray Athens to Sparta and then betray Sparta to Persia, had been Socrates' companion. Critias and Charmides, who would later lead the brutal oligarchic coup known as the 30 Tyrants, had listened to Socrates' teachings. When these men committed their crimes, when they brought horror to Athens, people remembered who their teacher had been. But Socrates also attracted genuinely philosophical minds. Plato, from one of Athens' most distinguished families, would become his most famous student, and the one who would immortalize his teaching in written dialogues. Xenophon, a soldier and historian, would also preserve Socratic conversations. Others, whose names are now lost, found in Socrates' method something that changed their lives fundamentally. What did these young men see in the ugly poor old man who asked endless questions? They saw someone who lived differently, who seemed free in a way that even the wealthiest Athenians were not. Socrates owned almost nothing, cared nothing for reputation or status, feared neither poverty nor death. He lived according to principles that he examined constantly, refusing to accept conventional wisdom simply because it was conventional. He also possessed a quality that Alcibiades once tried to describe in a speech preserved by Plato. He compared Socrates to those statues of Silenus found in workshops, ugly on the outside but containing images of gods within. Similarly, Alcibiades said, Socrates' external appearance was unprepossessing, even ridiculous, but inside was something divine, a wisdom and virtue that shone through once you got to know him. The younger Socrates, the man in his 40s and early 50s, was building both a following and a dangerous reputation. The comic poets, particularly Aristophanes, began to mock him in their plays. In 423 BC, when Socrates was 46, Aristophanes premiered The Clouds, a comedy that portrayed Socrates as the director of a thinkery, a school where students learn to make the weaker argument appear stronger, to justify any position through clever rhetoric, and to deny the existence of the traditional gods. The play was satire, not documentary. Aristophanes conflated Socrates with the sophists, the professional teachers who actually did charge fees and teach rhetoric. The real Socrates never charged money and claimed to teach nothing, but the damage was done. In the minds of average Athenians who saw the play, Socrates became associated with dangerous ideas, with skepticism about the gods, with corrupting the young through clever but empty argumentation. Socrates' response to such mockery was characteristically philosophical. When someone asked him how he felt about being ridiculed in the theatre before thousands of Athenians, he reportedly said, "I am being made fun of at a great party." He seemed genuinely indifferent to reputation, concerned only with whether the accusations were true. Since he knew he wasn't doing what Aristophanes portrayed, the mockery was irrelevant. But not everyone saw it that way. Resentments were building. The young aristocrats who followed Socrates were learning to question authority, to expose the ignorance of their elders, to think critically about traditions that had been accepted for generations. Their fathers and uncles, the men who ran Athens, did not appreciate this. They saw Socrates as a corrupter, a man who was undermining respect for authority and traditional values. The situation was complicated by Socrates' own beliefs about democracy. He never publicly advocated for oligarchy, but he was clearly skeptical about rule by majority vote. He compared Athens to a ship at sea. "Would you want the ship steered by a majority vote of the passengers?" he asked, "or by someone who actually knew navigation? Should medical decisions be made by popular vote or by trained physicians? If expertise matters in sailing and medicine, why doesn't it matter in governing?" These questions were subversive in democratic Athens. The very foundation of democracy was the belief that ordinary citizens, through collective deliberation, could make sound decisions about public affairs. Socrates seemed to doubt this. He seemed to suggest that the people, the demos, were unqualified to rule themselves. Yet Socrates also insisted that he never participated in politics beyond fulfilling his basic civic duties. He served on the Council of 500 once, when chosen by lot as was the democratic custom. He served in the military when required, but he avoided the assembly, refused to give speeches, never sought political office. His explanation was that his daimonion, his divine sign, warned him away from political life. If he had entered politics, he said, he would have been killed long ago. Only by remaining private could he do his philosophical work. This combination, skepticism about democracy combined with refusal to participate in political life, made Socrates a puzzle to his fellow citizens. Was he loyal to Athens or not? Did he support the democracy or secretly oppose it? And most dangerously, was he responsible for the crimes of his former associates? These questions would remain largely theoretical, until the catastrophe that was about to overtake Athens made them urgently practical. The city that had seemed invincible, that had dominated the Aegean for 2 generations, was about to lose everything. And in the trauma and recrimination that followed, someone would have to be held responsible. Someone would have to pay for Athens' failure. Socrates, the gadfly who questioned everything and everyone, who had taught many of Athens' most notorious figures, who seemed to mock the democracy even while living within it, would be the perfect target. The Peloponnesian War, which had begun in 431 BC when Socrates was 38, would grind on for 27 years before finally ending in utter disaster for Athens. The great democratic city that had stood up to the Persian Empire, that had created the Delian League, that had built the Parthenon and dominated Greek culture and politics for a generation, would be brought to its knees by Sparta and its allies. The turning point came in 415 BC with the Sicilian expedition. one of the greatest military catastrophes in ancient history. Athens, led by the charismatic Alcibiades, Socrates' former companion, decided to send a massive fleet to conquer Syracuse, the wealthy Greek city on the island of Sicily. It was an act of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary folly. The expedition was a total disaster. The entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were killed in battle or died as slaves in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they were worked to death under the Sicilian sun. Athens never truly recovered from the loss. Alcibiades himself defected to Sparta before the disaster unfolded, helping Athens' enemies with military advice. Later he would go to Persia, playing the great powers against each other. His career of betrayal would be remembered, and so would his association with Socrates. The war continued, but Athens was bleeding to death. The treasury was empty, the fleet was depleted, food was scarce, and in 404 BC, Athens finally surrendered. The long walls that connected the city to its port at Piraeus were torn down to the sound of flutes. The Spartan victors took satisfaction in humiliating their defeated enemy. What followed was horror. A group of pro-Spartan oligarchs, backed by Spartan force, seized control of Athens and dissolved the democracy. This group, known as the 30 Tyrants, began a reign of terror. They executed perhaps 500 Athenian citizens without trial, confiscating their property and using the proceeds to pay their Spartan garrison. The victims included political enemies, but also wealthy men whose only crime was having property worth stealing. Two of the 30's leaders were Critias and Charmides, both of whom had been associates of Socrates. Critias in particular had been one of Socrates' closest companions in earlier years. Now he was ordering executions and proscriptions, running a criminal regime backed by foreign military force. Socrates remained in Athens during this period. He did not participate in the 30's crimes, and at one crucial moment, he openly defied them. The 30 ordered Socrates and 4 other men to go to Salamis and arrest Leon, a wealthy citizen, so he could be executed and his property seized. It was a test of loyalty and a way to implicate more Athenians in the regime's crimes. Socrates listened to the order, then simply went home. He did not argue. He did not make speeches. He refused. The other 4 men went to Salamis and arrested Leon, who was duly murdered. Socrates did nothing, and in doing nothing committed an act of profound moral courage. The 30 fell after just 8 months. Democratic exiles gathered an army, marched on Athens, and overthrew the oligarchs. In the brief civil war that followed, Critias was killed fighting against the Democrats. Democracy was restored in 403 BC. But the restored democracy was traumatized, paranoid, and bitter. An amnesty was declared, forbidding prosecution for actions during the 30's reign. But everyone knew who had collaborated and who had resisted. The city was divided, suspicious, looking for enemies within. Socrates, who had defied the 30 but also taught them, who had questioned democracy but also lived under it, who seemed to many Athenians to be connected to everything that had gone wrong, became an obvious target. The man who had spent his life asking uncomfortable questions would now face the most uncomfortable question of all. Would Athens tolerate him any longer? The formal charges were brought in the spring of 399 BC, 4 years after the democracy's restoration. 3 men stepped forward as accusers: Meletus, a young poet of no particular distinction; Anytus, a wealthy tanner and democratic politician; and Lycon, representing the rhetoricians whom Socrates had spent decades exposing as frauds. The charges were vague but deadly: impiety toward the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth. Behind the legal language lay simpler accusations. Socrates questioned everything, including the gods. His former students had become tyrants and traitors. Athens had suffered terribly, and someone had to be responsible. Socrates, the gadfly who had stung the city for decades, who had made powerful men look foolish, who had taught young aristocrats to question their elders, seemed responsible for the city's moral corruption. The trial took place before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, selected by lot as was the democratic custom. They gathered in one of Athens' large covered courts, sitting on wooden benches, ready to judge whether the old philosopher deserved to live or die. Socrates was now 70 years old. His body, hardened by years of military service and remarkable for its endurance, was still vigorous. But he was old by ancient standards, and he knew this trial might be his last public act. He could have played to the jury's emotions. He could have brought his wife Xanthippe and their young sons forward to beg for mercy. He could have wept, pleaded, reminded the jurors of his military service, his poverty, his refusal to profit from his teaching. He did none of this. Instead, he delivered what amounted to a philosophical lecture, a defense speech that was really an explanation of his entire life and mission. He began by addressing the old accusations, the ones embedded in the public mind through years of comic mockery. He was not a natural philosopher investigating the heavens and the earth. He was not a sophist teaching rhetoric for pay. He taught nothing and claimed to know nothing. His only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing. Then he explained how his philosophical mission began. A friend had once gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle answered that no one was wiser. This perplexed Socrates, who knew he possessed no special knowledge. To understand the oracle's meaning, he began questioning people who were reputed to be wise, politicians, poets, craftsmen. What he discovered shocked him. These people claimed to know things they didn't actually understand. The politicians couldn't define justice, though they made judgments about it daily. The poets created beautiful works, but couldn't explain what made them beautiful. The craftsmen knew their trades, but thought this expertise extended to everything else. Socrates concluded that the oracle was right in a paradoxical way. He was wisest because he alone knew that he knew nothing. Everyone else thought they knew things they didn't, which made them doubly ignorant. Ignorant of the subject and ignorant of their own ignorance. This mission of questioning, Socrates told the jury, was divinely ordained. The god had appointed him as a gadfly to Athens, and he could not abandon this calling any more than a soldier could abandon his post in battle. If the jury ordered him to stop philosophizing, he would refuse, even at the cost of his life. The unexamined life is not worth living, he declared. Better to die than to live in sleepwalking ignorance. As for corrupting the youth, Socrates asked a simple question. Would he deliberately corrupt the young men around him? If he corrupted them, they would harm him, as bad men harm those near them. So by corrupting the youth, he would be harming himself intentionally. Did that make sense? Either he wasn't corrupting them, or he was doing so unintentionally, in which case he needed instruction, not execution. The logic was clear, but the jury was not persuaded by logic. They were responding to something deeper: resentment, fear, anger at what Athens had become. The vote came back. Guilty. 280 votes for conviction, 220 for acquittal. A narrow verdict, but final. Now came the penalty phase. Under Athenian law, the accuser proposed a punishment, and the defendant could propose an alternative. The jury would choose between them. Meletus had proposed death. Socrates needed to propose something else, something the jury could accept as adequate punishment. Instead, Socrates offered what amounted to an insult. Far from deserving punishment, he argued, he deserved to be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honour Athens could bestow, reserved for Olympic victors and the city's greatest benefactors. After all, he had spent his entire life improving his fellow citizens. Wasn't that worth honouring? Only after his friends insisted did he propose a fine of 1 mina of silver, then increasing it to 30 minae when supporters offered to pay. But the damage was done. His contempt for the proceedings was clear. The jury voted again. Death. 360 votes this time. More men voted to execute Socrates after hearing his defiance than had voted to convict him in the first place. He had sealed his own fate. Socrates accepted the verdict with the same calm he had maintained throughout. He told the jury that no evil can come to a good man, either in life or after death. He speculated that death might be a dreamless sleep, which would be pleasant, or a journey to another place where he could continue questioning the heroes of old. Either way, he saw no reason to fear it. He was led back to prison to await execution, but the actual sentence could not be carried out immediately. The day after the trial, the sacred ship to Delos departed on its annual pilgrimage to honour Apollo. According to Athenian custom, no executions could take place while the ship was away. The voyage took 30 days, giving Socrates a month to live. It was the richest month of Socrates' life, and paradoxically also his last. The prison cell became a classroom, a philosophical seminar unlike any Athens had seen. Every day his friends and students gathered to talk, to question, to prepare themselves for what was coming. And every day Socrates continued to teach, continued to examine life, continued to demonstrate what it meant to live philosophically until the final moment. These 30 days in prison, waiting for the ship to return from Delos, became the setting for some of the most famous philosophical conversations in history, preserved by Plato in dialogues that have shaped Western thought for 2,500 years. But they were also something more human and more moving. The last teachings of a master to his students, the final preparation for a death that everyone knew was coming, an extended farewell between friends who loved each other. The prison was a small public building near the Agora, nothing like the massive institutions we think of today. It was simply a place to hold people awaiting trial or execution, probably no more than a few rooms with barred windows and a courtyard. Socrates occupied a cell that was likely quite small, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with a simple wooden bed, a chair, and little else. A guard was posted outside, but Athenian prisons were remarkably casual compared to modern standards. There were no shackles, no solitary confinement, no harsh restrictions. Friends could visit freely during daylight hours. They could bring food, knowing that prison rations were minimal and poor quality. They could bring wine, cushions, anything that might make Socrates more comfortable. They could stay as long as they wished, from sunrise until the prison closed at sunset, and most remarkably, they could engage in the same philosophical discussions that had characterized their relationships with Socrates for years. And Socrates' friends came. They came every day, gathering in the cell or sometimes in the courtyard if the weather was pleasant and the guards allowed it. Among the regular visitors were the young men who had formed Socrates' closest circle over the previous years. Plato was there most days, though he would later note his absence on the final day, claiming illness. Whether this was physical illness or an excuse, a way to avoid witnessing what he could not bear to see, remains one of the small mysteries of history. Plato was perhaps 28 years old, from one of Athens' most distinguished families, and he had been studying with Socrates for perhaps 8 years. The old philosopher's execution would shatter something in Plato, driving him eventually to leave Athens and travel the Mediterranean before returning to found his academy. Crito was there every day. He was one of Socrates' oldest and closest friends, a man of Socrates' own generation who had known him for decades. Crito was wealthy, respectable, conventional in ways that Socrates was not, but he was absolutely devoted to his friend, willing to risk his own reputation and resources to save Socrates' life. Apollodorus came daily, a young man known for his emotional nature and his passionate devotion to philosophy. He would later be remembered as someone who wept more than anyone else during Socrates' final hours, unable to control his grief even when Socrates himself remained calm. There was Hermogenes, Epigenes, Aeschines, Antisthenes, who would later found the Cynic school of philosophy, Aristippus, who would establish the Cyrenaic school emphasizing pleasure, Euclides, who would create his own philosophical tradition in Megara. Looking around that prison cell, you saw gathered the men who would carry forward Socrates' mission, spreading his methods and ideas across the Greek world. Others came less regularly, family members checking on his welfare, old acquaintances paying their respects, curious citizens who had heard about the famous prisoner and wanted to see him one last time, even some who had been hostile to Socrates but were troubled by the verdict and came to make their peace. The conversations during these 30 days ranged across philosophy's deepest questions, but they kept returning to certain themes: death and the soul, knowledge and ignorance, virtue and the good life. And running through all of it, the question that Socrates had asked his entire life: how should we live? On some days the discussions were remarkably cheerful. Socrates would tell stories, make jokes, tease his friends about their logical errors just as he always had. The death sentence hanging over him seemed not to diminish his spirits, but rather to sharpen his focus, to make each conversation more precious and more intense. He argued that philosophers should not fear death because they had been practicing for it their entire lives. Philosophy, he insisted, was training in how to separate the soul from the body, how to focus on eternal truths rather than temporary physical pleasures. Every time a philosopher ignored hunger to continue thinking, every time they resisted sexual temptation to pursue wisdom, every time they chose contemplation over comfort, they were rehearsing for death, the final separation of soul and body. On other days the mood was darker. His friends could not maintain the philosophical detachment that Socrates seemed to achieve so easily. They wept. They argued with his reasoning. They challenged his calm acceptance of death, trying to find some flaw in his logic that would justify their grief and anger at the injustice being done to him. Socrates used even their emotional outbursts as teaching opportunities. When Apollodorus burst into tears saying he couldn't bear losing Socrates, the old philosopher gently questioned him. Would you rather lose me after I've lived an unexamined life? Would you prefer I was still here but had compromised my principles to avoid death? Which is worse, that I die having lived according to my convictions, or that I live having betrayed them? The question of the soul's immortality occupied much of their discussion, particularly in the final days. Socrates offered several arguments, working through the logic carefully with his companions, subjecting each argument to the same rigorous examination he applied to everything else. First, he argued from opposites. Everything in nature comes from its opposite, he observed. Hot from cold, cold from hot. Waking from sleeping, sleeping from waking. The living come from the dead, just as the dead come from the living. This cycle could not have started from nothing. It must continue. Therefore, the souls of the dead must exist in some state, ready to return to life. Second, he argued from recollection. When we learn mathematics or philosophy, he suggested, we're not acquiring completely new knowledge but remembering what we knew before birth. A slave boy with no education can solve geometric problems if asked the right questions, discovering truths that must have been in his soul all along. If the soul knew these things before birth, it must have existed then. And if it existed before this life, why shouldn't it exist after? Third, he argued from the soul's nature. The soul is simple and uniform, not a composite of parts that might decompose. It is invisible, immaterial, unchanging in its essence. Physical things, which are composite, decay and dissolve. But the soul, being simple, has no parts to separate. How then could it die? Fourth, and most powerfully, he argued that the soul's essence is life itself. Death is the opposite of life, But can the soul, which is the principle of life, admit its opposite? Can fire become cold while remaining fire? Can snow become hot while remaining snow? No. Similarly, the soul cannot become dead while remaining a soul. When death approaches, the soul must either perish, which contradicts its nature, or depart to exist elsewhere. Not all his friends found these arguments convincing. Some raised objections. Simmias suggested that perhaps the soul was like a harmony created by the body, real but dependent on its physical basis, dying when the body died like music ceasing when a lyre breaks. Cebes worried that even if the soul was immortal, it might weaken and decay through multiple incarnations until it finally dissolved. Socrates addressed each objection seriously, not dismissing doubts, but working through them logically. He showed that the soul could not be a mere harmony of the body because it rules the body, opposes bodily desires, exists before the body takes its mature form. He argued that the soul could not decay if it was truly immortal, for decay implies change through time, and the soul exists beyond time in its essence. The discussions went on for hours each day, sometimes becoming quite technical, other times more mystical and speculative. Socrates spoke of a journey the soul makes after death, of judgment, of rewards for the just and punishments for the unjust. He described a vision of the earth as a beautiful sphere, with many dwellings for souls, places of punishment underground and places of reward in higher, purer regions. Whether he believed these myths literally or offered them as useful fictions to encourage virtue, we cannot know, but he spoke with such conviction, such calm certainty, that his friends found themselves believing, or at least wanting to believe, that death was not the end but a transition to something better. Throughout these conversations, certain themes emerged repeatedly, ideas that Socrates had spent his entire life exploring and was now, in his final days, bringing to their clearest expression. First, that virtue is knowledge. To know what is good is to do it. No one does evil willingly. They do it out of ignorance, mistaking what is bad for what is good. If people truly understood that virtue leads to happiness and vice to misery, they would always choose virtue. This was a radical claim, denying that people could knowingly choose evil, but Socrates defended it rigorously. Second, that the unexamined life is not worth living. This had been his constant refrain throughout his career, and it took on new meaning in the shadow of death. He was facing execution rather than exile precisely because he refused to abandon the examined life, refused to stop questioning, refused to accept ignorance disguised as knowledge. Third, that one should never do wrong, even in response to wrong. When the state wronged him through an unjust verdict, he would not respond by breaking the law through escape. The moral person maintains their integrity regardless of how others behave. To repay wrong with wrong is to become like those who wrong you. Fourth, that death is not to be feared. Either it is a dreamless sleep which is pleasant and peaceful, or it is a transition to another existence where the soul continues. In the first case, we simply cease to experience anything, which is not terrible. In the second, we continue in a place where true justice reigns, and we can spend eternity in conversation with the great souls of the past, which would be wonderful. The depth of feeling in that prison cell during those 30 days must have been extraordinary. Here were young men who had found in Socrates not just a teacher, but a model of how to live, a living demonstration that philosophy was not abstract theory, but a practical discipline that shaped every action and decision. They were watching that model face its ultimate test, and they were witnessing him pass it with a calm courage that confirmed everything he had taught them. Some of them would remember these days for the rest of their lives, trying to recapture in their own teachings the spirit of those conversations, the unique combination of intellectual rigor and deep humanity that characterized Socrates at his best. Plato would spend decades writing dialogues that returned again and again to these themes, trying to preserve not just Socrates' words but his presence, his method, his way of being in the world. About a week into his imprisonment, very early one morning before dawn, Crito arrived at the prison with his desperate escape plan. The scene that followed, preserved in Plato's dialogue, Crito, reveals perhaps more clearly than any other moment the principles by which Socrates lived and for which he would die. Crito had bribed the guards to let him in at an unusual hour. The prison was dark and quiet. Socrates was sleeping peacefully, which astonished Crito. How could a man under sentence of death sleep so soundly? When Crito woke him, Socrates sat up calmly and asked why his friend had come so early. Crito brought news. The sacred ship would return later that day or the next. Socrates' time was running out, but everything was arranged for an escape. Guards had been bribed, not just the ones at the prison but those at the city gates. Friends in Thessaly, a region north of Athens, had offered Socrates sanctuary. Money was available, enough to ensure his comfort for the rest of his life. All Socrates had to do was agree to leave. The argument Crito made was emotional and practical. First, he would lose his dearest friend if Socrates died. Second, people would think Crito had been unwilling to spend money to save Socrates, damaging Crito's reputation. Third, Socrates had a duty to his sons to stay alive and raise them rather than abandoning them. Fourth, it was cowardly to accept death when escape was possible. Fifth, Socrates would be giving his enemies what they wanted by dying. These were powerful arguments based on friendship, reputation, family duty, and pride. Most men would have found them convincing, but Socrates characteristically wanted to examine the question logically rather than emotionally. He began by dismissing the concern about reputation. The opinions of the many don't matter, he argued. Only the opinion of those who truly understand justice matters. If what matters is doing what's right, not what people think about you, then Crito's worry about his reputation was irrelevant. Then he moved to the central question: would it be right to escape? To answer this, he needed to establish some principles. They work through these together in their characteristic dialectical method. First principle: we should never do wrong, even in response to wrong being done to us. Crito agreed. Second principle: doing wrong means harming others. Crito agreed. Third principle: breaking just laws harms the city and its citizens. After some discussion, Crito agreed to this as well. Now the question became, are the laws of Athens just, and would escaping break them? Socrates imagined the laws of Athens speaking to him directly, making their case for why he should stay. Socrates, the laws would say, we gave you life. Your father married your mother under our protection. We provided the framework within which you were born. Are we not like your parents, deserving of your respect and obedience? We educated you, the laws continued. We provided the schools, the gymnasiums, the cultural context in which you developed into the man you are. We protected you, maintained order, enabled commerce and philosophy to flourish. You have benefited from us your entire life. We gave you freedom, the laws pointed out. Any Athenian who does not like our laws can leave, taking his property with him. We do not compel anyone to stay, but if you choose to stay, to raise your children here, to live under our protection for 70 years, you have implicitly agreed to obey us. You, Socrates, stayed in Athens when you could have left. You fought in our wars. You participated in our government when called. You raised your children under our laws. Through all these actions, you made an agreement with us. And now, just because we have made a decision you don't like, will you break that agreement? If you escape, what will you be saying? That agreements should be kept only when convenient? That laws should be obeyed only when they work in your favour? Your entire life has been about the importance of justice and virtue. Will you abandon those principles to save your physical body? The argument was not just about preserving social order, but about personal integrity. Socrates had lived his entire life insisting that virtue was the highest good, that one should never compromise principles for convenience or survival. To flee now would be to reveal that he didn't truly believe what he had taught, that when tested, he would abandon philosophy to save his skin. Moreover, Socrates argued, escaping would harm him more than dying would. His soul would be corrupted by the injustice of his action. He would spend the rest of his life as a hypocrite, a man who preached virtue but practiced expediency. Better to die with his integrity intact than to live as a compromised person. Crito tried other arguments, but Socrates had an answer for each. What about his sons? Better for them to have a father who died honourably than one who lived dishonourably. What about giving his enemies satisfaction? Their satisfaction or displeasure was irrelevant. What mattered was whether his action was just. What about the injustice of his verdict? The law itself was just even if this particular judgment was wrong, and he had agreed to abide by Athenian law by choosing to live there. As the dawn light gradually filled the cell, Crito finally understood that he had lost the argument. Socrates would not escape. His friend would die, not from any lack of opportunity or resources to avoid death, but from a principled choice, a decision that maintaining integrity mattered more than preserving life. Crito left the cell defeated, and Socrates resumed his wait for the sacred ship's return, spending his final days as he had spent his entire life, in philosophical conversation, examining the most important questions, trying to understand how to live well, and now, how to die well. The days continued their slow progression toward the inevitable end. Each morning the prisoners and guards would look toward the harbour, waiting for the sacred ship to return from Delos. Each morning it was not there. Each day was a gift, another opportunity for conversation, for teaching, for demonstrating how a philosopher faces death. Socrates spent these final days in remarkable ways. He wrote poetry, something he had never done before. According to Plato, Socrates had a recurring dream throughout his life in which a figure appeared telling him to practice music. He had always interpreted this as encouragement for his philosophical work, understanding music broadly as the harmony of the soul. But now, facing death, he wondered if the dream meant he should compose actual poems. So he wrote a hymn to Apollo and set some of Aesop's fables into verse. It was a strange occupation for a man known for never writing anything down, for insisting that wisdom came through dialogue, not text. Perhaps it was simply a way to pass the time, or perhaps at the end Socrates wanted to leave something tangible, some acknowledgement that there were multiple paths to wisdom. He also continued his practice of questioning everything, including the conventions surrounding death itself. When friends came to visit, he engaged them in philosophical discussion as naturally as if they were meeting in the agora for their usual conversations. Death was approaching, but that didn't change the fundamental activity of life, which was examining ideas and pursuing truth. His wife Xanthippe visited, though the visits were apparently difficult. Plato portrays her as emotional, weeping, lamenting, unable to accept what was happening. At one point, Socrates reportedly asked friends to take her home, not out of cruelty, but because her grief was disrupting the philosophical discussions he wanted to continue. We know almost nothing else about Xanthippe. She appears only briefly in the historical record, primarily in this moment of crisis. Later tradition would paint her as a shrew, a difficult woman married to a saint. But the truth is likely more complex. She was married to a man who owned nothing, earned nothing, spent his days talking to other men in the marketplace, and had now been condemned to death for his activities. Her grief and frustration were entirely understandable. They had children together, 3 sons. The oldest was perhaps in his late teens by the time of Socrates' death. The youngest was still very young, possibly just a toddler. What kind of father Socrates was, we can only guess. Clearly he spent more time in philosophical conversation than in domestic life. His poverty meant his sons would inherit nothing. His execution meant they would grow up without a father, bearing the stigma of his condemnation. Yet Socrates seemed strangely unconcerned about this. When pressed about his sons, he argued that staying alive but living unjustly would harm them more than dying. It was better for them to have a father who died for principle than one who lived without it. This seems callous from a modern perspective, but it reflected Socrates' absolute conviction that virtue matters more than survival, that how you live is more important than how long you live. Finally, on a spring morning in 399 BC, the ship was sighted returning from Delos. The prisoners and guards saw it enter the harbour in the late afternoon. By the time it docked and official word reached the prison, evening had arrived. The execution would take place the next day. That final night, Socrates slept soundly. His friends, gathered outside the prison, waited anxiously for dawn. When they were finally admitted in the early morning, they found Socrates awake, sitting on his bed, rubbing his leg where chains had been removed. He smiled at them and remarked on the strange relationship between pleasure and pain, how one follows the other, like two creatures joined at the head. It was a characteristic observation, philosophical even in this moment. Socrates could not stop being Socrates, could not stop noticing, questioning, analysing, even as death approached. The friends gathered in the cell for one last conversation. This final discussion, preserved by Plato in the dialogue called Phaedo, ranged across the deepest questions about death, the soul, and immortality. Socrates led the conversation calmly, methodically working through arguments about why the soul must survive death, why the philosopher should not fear the end of bodily existence. The sun climbed higher, the morning stretched toward noon, and then the jailer entered, apologizing for what he must do. He was weeping. This duty of administering poison to condemned prisoners was the worst part of his job, and in Socrates' case, it was particularly painful. The jailer had come to know and respect the old philosopher during his 30 days of imprisonment. Socrates comforted him, praised him for his kindness, and told him not to grieve. Then he asked practical questions about how the poison worked, what he should expect, what he should do. The jailer explained, "Drink the poison, then walk around until your legs feel heavy. Lie down. The numbness will spread upward until it reaches the heart." The poison itself was a mixture of hemlock and water. Hemlock contains conine, a neurotoxin that causes progressive paralysis. Death comes from respiratory failure as the paralysis reaches the muscles that control breathing. It is not a pleasant death, though it is not as agonizing as some methods of execution. Consciousness remains until near the end. The jailer left to prepare the cup. Socrates turned to his companions and suggested they should send away Xanthippe and the children. His wife had been brought one last time with the youngest son, but Socrates wanted his final hours to be philosophical, not emotional. Crito arranged for them to be taken home. Then the jailer returned, carrying the clay cup containing the poison. Socrates took it without hesitation. His friends gasped. Some began to weep. Socrates looked at them with what Plato describes as his characteristic calmness. "What is this strange outcry?" he asked. "I sent away the women mainly in order that they might not behave in this way, for I have heard that one should die in silence, be quiet and bear up." He lifted the cup. Someone, probably Crito, asked if he wanted to pour a libation to the gods. Socrates asked the jailer if there was enough for that. The jailer said no. The dose was measured precisely, just enough for the required effect. Socrates smiled at this detail, found it somehow fitting, and said simply, "But I may and must pray to the gods that my journey from this world to the next may be prosperous." He raised the cup to his lips and drank it down steadily and calmly, not hesitating, not showing any sign of disgust at what must have been a bitter taste. His friends, watching this, could no longer control their tears. They wept openly, not for Socrates but for themselves, for the loss they were about to suffer. Socrates began to walk around the cell as instructed. He spoke calmly, making observations about the process, noting when his feet began to feel heavy. After a few minutes he lay down on the bed. The jailer, who had stayed to monitor the poison's effects, touched his feet and legs, asking if he could feel anything. Socrates said no. The numbness was spreading upward. They continued talking. The paralysis worked its way up his body. When it reached his abdomen, Socrates spoke his last words. He addressed Crito. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it. Asclepius was the god of healing. When someone recovered from illness, tradition called for sacrificing a rooster to thank the god. In his final breath, Socrates was suggesting that death was a cure, that he was being healed of the sickness of life itself. It was a final philosophical statement, a last assertion that death should not be feared, but welcomed as the soul's liberation from the body. Crito asked if there was anything else he wanted to say. There was no answer. A few moments later, the jailer pulled aside the cloth that covered Socrates' face and checked his eyes. Socrates was dead. Crito closed his eyes and mouth. The friends who had watched stood in stunned silence. Then Phaedo, one of the young men present, spoke the words that would close Plato's account of the scene. Such was the end of our friend, a man who, we would say, was of all those we have known the best and also the wisest and most just. The body was prepared for burial according to Athenian custom. The funeral was simple, befitting a man who had owned almost nothing. He was buried somewhere in Athens, though the exact location has been lost to history. No elaborate monument marked the grave. No expensive tomb preserved his memory. But the man who had written nothing left something far more durable than stone monuments. His students, particularly Plato, would spend the rest of their lives recording his teachings, analysing his method, trying to understand and convey what had made Socrates unique. The conversations that had taken place in the agora, in the gymnasiums, in that prison cell during the final 30 days, would be preserved in dialogues that would become the foundation of Western philosophy. The question that haunted Athens after Socrates' death was whether they had made a terrible mistake. Had they just executed the wisest man in the city? Had they allowed fear and resentment to guide them into an act of monstrous injustice? The answer came swiftly and painfully. Within years, the mood shifted dramatically. The men who had prosecuted Socrates found themselves shunned by respectable society. Meletus, the young poet who had brought the initial charges, was reportedly executed, though the sources disagree about the exact circumstances and charges. Some say he was lynched by an angry mob who blamed him for Socrates' death. Others claim he was formally tried and condemned. Whatever the truth, he did not live long after his victim. Anytus, the democratic politician and tanner who had been the real force behind the prosecution, fled Athens entirely. His property was confiscated, his reputation destroyed. He settled in Pontus, on the Black Sea, far from the city whose democracy he had claimed to defend. Even there, according to one account, he was driven out when the locals learned who he was and what he had done. The third accuser, Lycon, simply disappeared from the historical record. Whatever became of him, he was remembered only as one of the men who killed Socrates, and that was not a legacy anyone in Athens envied. The city that had condemned Socrates now seemed ashamed of what it had done. Later generations of Athenians would look back on 399 BC as a moment of collective madness, a time when fear and political paranoia led them to destroy their greatest treasure. The execution became Athens' permanent stain, the act that could never be justified or explained away. But the damage was irreversible in one sense and transformative in another. Socrates was dead. The voice that had questioned everything in the agora would never be heard again. The ugly little man with the penetrating questions and the unsettling calm was gone. But what he represented, what he had done, the method he had developed and the life he had lived, these did not die with him. The execution of Socrates became the defining failure of Athenian democracy. the case study that every critic of popular government would cite for the next 500 years. If the people, in their wisdom, could condemn the wisest man in the city, what did that say about the wisdom of the people? If majority vote could produce such manifest injustice, what was the value of democracy? Plato, more than anyone, would make this argument. His Republic, written decades after his teacher's death, proposed an alternative to democracy, the rule of philosopher kings, wise individuals who understood the good and could govern according to reason rather than popular passion. The dialogue is, in part, a response to the question, how could Athens have killed Socrates? The answer, because democracy gives power to those who don't understand, who mistake opinion for knowledge, who are swayed by rhetoric rather than guided by truth. But something else had happened too, something perhaps more important than any political argument. In accepting his death rather than fleeing into exile, in maintaining his principles even when they cost him everything, Socrates had demonstrated something profound about the examined life. He had shown, through his final actions as much as through his years of teaching, that living according to principle matters more than simply living, that integrity matters more than survival, that some things, namely virtue and truth, are worth dying for. His method, the practice of questioning, examining, refusing to accept easy answers, survived him, and spread through his students like seeds carried by the wind. The Socratic method became the foundation of philosophical education, legal cross-examination, scientific inquiry, any field where truth matters more than comfort or convention. The dialogues Plato wrote with Socrates as the central figure and primary speaker would shape Western thought for millennia. The Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, the Apology, the Crito, the Meno, the Euthyphro, dozens of other works, all preserve the voice of a man who never wrote anything himself. Through Plato's literary genius, Socrates became immortal in a way he never anticipated. His words and methods transmitted to every generation since. These dialogues created a literary genre, the philosophical dialogue, that would be imitated for centuries. Cicero would write dialogues in Latin, modelling them on Plato's Greek. Medieval philosophers would use the dialogue form to explore theological questions. Renaissance humanists would revive it as a way to present ideas dramatically. Even modern philosophers occasionally return to the form, trying to recapture something of the dynamic conversational quality of Socratic inquiry. But Plato's Socrates, brilliant as he was only one version of the master. Other students contributed their own memories and interpretations. Xenophon, the soldier and historian who had been present during some of Socrates' final days, wrote his own Socratic dialogues, presenting a somewhat different picture of the master. Xenophon's Socrates was more practical and less mystical than Plato's, more concerned with everyday ethics than with abstract metaphysics. He was a moral teacher who used common sense and traditional wisdom rather than a philosophical revolutionary probing the foundations of knowledge. Which version is closer to the historical Socrates? We cannot know. What we have are two sophisticated literary portrayals, each reflecting not just Socrates but also the author's own philosophical commitments and literary gifts. Together, they ensured that Socrates would never be forgotten, even if the real man remained elusive, filtered through the memories and agendas of his admirers. Other students founded philosophical schools that traced their inspiration back to Socrates, each emphasizing different aspects of his teaching and example. Antisthenes established what became known as cynicism, emphasizing Socrates' indifference to physical comfort and social convention. The Cynics lived in deliberate poverty, rejected all luxury, and criticized social norms with sharp wit. Diogenes, the most famous cynic who lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great to stop blocking his sunlight, was following a path suggested by Socrates' own lifestyle. Aristippus founded the Cyrenaic school, which emphasized Socrates' teaching about pleasure and the good life, but interpreted it in a hedonistic direction. If the soul is what matters, and if a well-ordered soul experiences pleasure, then perhaps the pursuit of refined pleasure is the path to happiness. This was not the lesson Socrates intended, but it showed how different students could draw different conclusions from the same teacher. Euclides of Megara created his own school that combined Socratic ethics with the metaphysics of Parmenides, emphasizing the unity and unchanging nature of the good. His students would later develop complex logical arguments that prefigured medieval scholastic philosophy. But the most influential interpretation of Socrates came through the Stoics, who emerged in the generation after Plato. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, studied in Plato's academy and absorbed the image of Socrates as the ideal wise man. The Stoics made Socrates their hero, the perfect example of someone living according to reason, maintaining equanimity in the face of fortune's changes, accepting what he could not control while focusing on what he could, his own judgments and actions. The Stoics told stories about Socrates that emphasized his self-control and indifference to external circumstances. They described how he could stand motionless for hours, lost in thought, how he remained calm when his wife dumped water on his head, how he faced death without fear. These stories, whether historically accurate or not, created a portrait of the Stoic sage, and that sage looked remarkably like Socrates. Through Stoicism, Socratic ideas spread across the Mediterranean world. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote his Meditations while campaigning on the Danube, was self-consciously following a Socratic path, using philosophy as a daily practice to examine his life and maintain virtue. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of Stoicism's greatest teachers, constantly invoked Socrates as a model of how to live and die with dignity. The early Christians found in Socrates something profoundly appealing. A pagan who had lived a virtuous life, taught moral truth, and died as a martyr for his convictions. Justin Martyr, a Christian apologist of the 2nd century AD, went so far as to argue that Socrates had been inspired by the same divine logos that would later be incarnated as Christ. Anyone who lived according to reason, Justin claimed, was in some sense a Christian, even if they lived before Christ. By this logic, Socrates was a proto-Christian, martyred for truth just as the Christian martyrs were. This interpretation allowed Christianity to claim the best of pagan philosophy as preparation for the gospel. Augustine, the great Latin Church father, had studied the pagan philosophers before his conversion, and he brought their insights into Christian theology. Socrates' emphasis on self-knowledge, his belief that virtue is the path to happiness, his conviction that the soul is immortal, all of these could be baptized and incorporated into Christian thought. Medieval philosophers, both Christian and Islamic, studied Socrates as a model of wisdom. His method of questioning, of exposing ignorance through dialectic, became the foundation of scholastic disputation. The universities that emerged in medieval Europe organized their teaching around Socratic principles: question authority, examine assumptions, define terms clearly, follow arguments wherever they lead, even if they challenge received wisdom. The Islamic philosophers, particularly Al-Farabi and Averroes, knew Socrates primarily through Plato's dialogues, and placed him in a lineage of prophetic philosophers who had glimpsed divine truth through reason alone. Socrates became, in their interpretation, a model of the philosopher-prophet, someone whose rational inquiry led them to truths that others received only through revelation. The Renaissance rediscovered the historical Socrates with renewed energy and fresh eyes. Humanist scholars translated Plato's dialogues directly from Greek into Latin, bypassing the sometimes unreliable medieval versions. The printing press made these texts widely available for the first time. Suddenly, educated Europeans across the continent could read Socrates' words, or at least Plato's version of them, in their own studies. Erasmus, the great Dutch humanist, admired Socrates as a model of Christian virtue avant la lettre. He He even went so far as to write St. Socrates Pray for Us, treating the pagan philosopher as a kind of honorary Christian saint. This was controversial, but it reflected a widespread Renaissance belief that pagan wisdom and Christian truth were ultimately compatible, that God had scattered rays of truth throughout human history, and that Socrates had caught one of those rays. Montaigne, the French essayist who invented the personal essay as a literary form, constantly invoked Socrates as his model. The essay, with its wandering structure, its willingness to follow thought wherever it leads, its honest admission of uncertainty, its skeptical questioning of received wisdom, was Socratic in spirit. Montaigne's motto, Que sais-je? What do I know? Echoed Socrates' famous profession of ignorance. The Enlightenment philosophes saw in Socrates a precursor to their own project of questioning authority and established belief through reason. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Kant all invoked Socrates as an example of the courage needed to think for oneself, to challenge tradition, to face persecution for truth. The man who had died asking questions became the patron saint of those who questioned everything, from religious dogma to political authority to scientific orthodoxy. Voltaire in particular saw in Socrates' execution a warning about what happens when intolerance and superstition dominate society. The philosophe who had spent his life fighting religious persecution looked back at Socrates and saw a kindred spirit, someone who had been killed by an alliance of religious and political power threatened by independent thought. But Socrates also inspired critics and challengers. Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, launched a famous attack on Socrates, arguing that his emphasis on reason and dialectic had destroyed something vital in Greek culture. According to Nietzsche, pre-Socratic Greece had possessed a tragic wisdom, a willingness to face the terrible truths of existence without flinching, an embrace of life in all its horror and beauty. The great tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles embodied this spirit. Then came Socrates with his insistence that everything be examined logically, that intuition and myth be replaced by rational argument, that we only truly know what we can define and defend through dialectic. This Socratic rationalism, Nietzsche argued, killed the tragic spirit. It created a culture that valued logic over life, that preferred neat definitions to messy reality, that thought you could solve the deepest mysteries of existence through clever questioning. Moreover, Nietzsche claimed Socrates represented a kind of ressentiment, a slave morality disguised as wisdom. Socrates was ugly, poor, physically unimpressive. He couldn't compete in the arenas where aristocratic Greeks gained honour, war, athletics, political leadership. So he invented a new arena where he could dominate: dialectic, the art of making people look stupid through questioning. His philosophy of the soul and virtue was, in Nietzsche's reading, a way of devaluing everything he couldn't have, a sour grape's rejection of physical beauty, wealth, and power. Nietzsche's critique highlighted something important. Socrates represented a particular kind of wisdom, emphasizing reason, logic, and argument above intuition, tradition, and instinct. There are other kinds of wisdom, based on experience, artistic insight, mystical vision, or practical know-how that don't reduce to rational argument. Socrates' method, powerful as it was, had its limits and costs. Yet even those who rejected Socrates' answers could not escape his questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? How should we live? What can we truly know? These remain the fundamental questions of human existence. Every ethical theory, every political philosophy, every religious tradition, every attempt to live a meaningful life must grapple with questions that Socrates was asking 2,500 years ago in the Agora of Athens. In the 20th century, Socrates remained startlingly relevant despite, or perhaps because of, the tumultuous changes of that era. Karl Popper, in his influential work The Open Society and Its Enemies, defended Socrates while attacking Plato, arguing that the student had betrayed the teacher. Socrates in Popper's reading represented critical rationalism, the willingness to question everything and accept that we might be wrong. Plato represented dogmatic rationalism, the belief that we could arrive at certain truths and then impose them on society. The difference was crucial. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, returned to Socrates as a model of moral thinking. The problem with Eichmann, she argued, was not that he was a monster, but that he was thoughtless, that he never examined what he was doing, never questioned the orders he received. The examined life, which Socrates insisted was the only life worth living, was a bulwark against such moral blindness. If only Eichmann had thought, if only he had questioned, he might not have participated in atrocities. The civil rights movement and other campaigns for social justice found in Socrates a model of civil disobedience. He had obeyed unjust laws, to be sure, but he had done so while constantly questioning them, while insisting on his right to challenge authority through speech and reason. Martin Luther King Jr., writing from Birmingham jail, invoked Socrates' willingness to accept punishment rather than stop questioning, his insistence that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. In philosophy departments today, Socrates remains the foundational figure. The first course in philosophy, Introduction to Philosophy, typically begins with Socrates. The dialectical method, questioning assumptions and following arguments wherever they lead, remains the core practice of philosophical inquiry. Every philosophy student learns to ask, "What do you mean by that?" and "How do you know?" These are Socratic questions. The Socratic method also shapes legal education. Law schools train students through the case method, which is essentially Socratic questioning applied to legal reasoning. Professors ask students to defend positions, then probe for weaknesses, then push them to consider counter-arguments, all in the service of teaching them to think clearly about complex issues. It's not identical to Socrates' practice, but it descends from it. In our own time, Socrates remains urgently relevant, perhaps more than ever. We live in an age of information overload, where anyone can find confirmation for any belief, where confident ignorance flourishes on social media, where complex issues are reduced to simplistic slogans, where expertise is dismissed and critical thinking is rare. The Socratic insistence on examining assumptions, defining terms clearly, following arguments logically, admitting ignorance when we don't know, these are essential tools for navigating our complex world. His fate also resonates powerfully in our current moment. In an age of cancel culture, Twitter mobs, and political polarization, the story of a man condemned for asking unpopular questions, for making powerful people uncomfortable, for refusing to conform to majority opinion, speaks directly to our situation. Socrates reminds us that truth-telling carries risks, that the examined life often conflicts with social harmony, that courage matters not just physically, but intellectually and morally. His emphasis on self-knowledge, "Know thyself," the motto inscribed at Delphi that Socrates made his own, remains a challenge in an age of constant distraction and external stimulation. How can we know ourselves when we're always looking at screens, consuming media, reacting to others? The Socratic call to turn inward, to examine our own beliefs and motivations, to question what we think we know, is countercultural in the most literal sense. What can we learn from a man who died 2,400 years ago in a city that no longer exists, executed by a political system that vanished millennia ago? Perhaps these lessons, tested by 25 centuries and still resonant. First, that questions matter more than answers. Socrates never claimed to teach anything, only to ask questions. He never wrote a doctrine or founded a school with official teachings. He demonstrated through his life that the process of inquiry matters more than any particular conclusion, that staying curious and open to being wrong is more valuable than having all the answers. Second, that integrity matters more than success or survival. Socrates could have escaped death by fleeing Athens or by promising to stop his philosophical activities. He chose execution rather than compromise his principles. This seems extreme to our pragmatic age, but it reminds us that some things, our core commitments and values, define who we are more than physical survival does. Third, that knowledge begins with acknowledging ignorance. I know that I know nothing sounds like false modesty, but it's actually a profound epistemological claim. Most of what we think we know is actually unexamined opinion, received wisdom, conventional belief. True knowledge requires recognizing the difference between what we actually understand and what we merely believe. Fourth, that the unexamined life is not worth living. This, more than anything, is Socrates' lasting message. To live without reflection, without questioning, without examining our choices and beliefs, is to live a diminished life, to drift through existence rather than actively shaping it. We are capable of reason, of thought, of examining our lives. To not use these capacities is to waste our distinctively human potential. Fifth, that reason, despite its limits, is our best tool for pursuing truth and navigating disagreement. Socrates didn't think reason could solve every problem or answer every question, but he believed that honest, rigorous, collaborative thinking, the kind of thinking that happens in real dialogue, was better than appeals to authority, tradition, or force. This conviction, that we should try to resolve our differences through argument rather than power, remains the foundation of any decent society. But we must acknowledge the paradox at the heart of Socrates' legacy. Everything we know about him comes from others. He wrote nothing. We have no direct access to his thoughts, except as filtered through students who had their own philosophical agendas. Plato's Socrates is almost certainly different from the historical Socrates, embellished, idealized, used as a character to express ideas that may have been Plato's own rather than his teachers'. The real Socrates, the man who walked the streets of Athens, who fought at Potidaea and Delium, who drank the hemlock, is lost to us. What we have instead is something perhaps more valuable, an ideal, a model of what philosophical life can be, a demonstration of how to live and die with integrity. That ideal shaped the ancient world. The Stoics, the Cynics, the Skeptics, all traced their lineage back to Socrates, each emphasizing different aspects of his teaching and practice. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote his Meditations while campaigning on the Danube, was self-consciously following a Socratic path, using philosophy as a daily practice to examine his life and maintain virtue. The early Christians found in Socrates a pagan saint, a man who had glimpsed truth through reason alone and died for his convictions. Justin Martyr, a Christian apologist of the 2nd century AD, argued that Socrates had been inspired by the same divine logos that would later be incarnated as Christ. Anyone who lived according to reason, Justin claimed, was in some sense a Christian, even if they lived before Christ. By this logic, Socrates was a proto-Christian, martyred for truth. Medieval philosophers, both Christian and Islamic, studied Socrates as a model of wisdom. His method of questioning, of exposing ignorance, of seeking definition through dialectic, became the foundation of scholastic disputation. The universities that emerged in medieval Europe organized their teaching around Socratic principles: question, discuss, define, debate. The Renaissance rediscovered the historical Socrates with renewed interest. Humanist scholars translated Plato's dialogues from Greek into Latin, making them available to a wider European audience. Socrates became a symbol of human wisdom, independent of divine revelation, a champion of reason in an age rediscovering classical values. The Enlightenment philosophers saw in Socrates a precursor to their own project of questioning authority and established belief. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau all invoke Socrates as an example of the courage needed to think for oneself, to challenge tradition, to face persecution for truth. The man who had died asking questions became the patron saint of those who questioned everything. But Socrates also inspired critics. Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, launched a famous attack on Socrates, arguing that his emphasis on reason and dialectic had destroyed the tragic spirit of pre-Socratic Greece. By insisting that everything be examined logically, that intuition and myth be replaced by rational argument, Socrates had killed something vital in Greek culture. The examined life, Nietzsche suggested, was a diminished life, cut off from the instinctive sources of human creativity and power. Nietzsche's critique highlighted something important. Socrates represented a particular kind of wisdom, emphasizing reason, logic, and argument. There are other kinds of wisdom based on intuition, experience, tradition, or mystical insight. Socrates' method, powerful as it was, had its limits. Yet even those who rejected Socrates' answers could not escape his questions. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? These remain the fundamental questions of human existence. Every ethical theory, every political philosophy, every attempt to live a good life must grapple with questions that Socrates was asking 2,500 years ago in the Agora of Athens. In our own time, Socrates remains startlingly relevant. His method of questioning is more necessary than ever in an age of information overload, fake news, and confident ignorance. The Socratic insistence on examining assumptions, defining terms clearly, following arguments wherever they lead, these are essential tools for navigating a complex world. His fate also resonates. In an age of cancel culture, Twitter mobs, and political polarization, the story of a man condemned for asking unpopular questions, for making powerful people uncomfortable, for refusing to conform to majority opinion, speaks directly to our situation. Socrates reminds us that truth-telling carries risks, that the examined life often conflicts with social harmony, that courage matters. What can we learn from a man who died 2,400 years ago in a city that no longer exists? Perhaps this, that questions matter more than answers, that integrity matters more than success, that how we live matters more than how long we live. That reason, despite its limits, is our best tool for navigating a confusing world. That knowledge begins with acknowledging ignorance, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates never promised to make people happy. He never promised to make them successful. He promised only to make them think, to wake them from sleepwalking certainty, to sting them into awareness like a gadfly on a lazy horse. For this, Athens killed him. For this, history remembers him. The grave is lost. The body returned to dust 2,400 years ago. But the voice persists, asking its infuriating, necessary questions in every age and every language. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? And most urgently, most Socratically, are you certain you know what you think you know? If you have travelled with me through this remarkable story, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription helps bring more of these journeys into history to life. Tell me in the comments what question of Socrates strikes you most deeply. What part of his life or method speaks to your own experience? I read every comment and always love hearing your thoughts. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. The old man who drank the hemlock is gone, but his questions remain, patient and eternal, waiting for each new generation to grapple with them. May we have the courage to ask and the wisdom to know when we don't know the answers. Good night,